Kelvin, if I can invite both of our speakers to stand up at their lecterns, I suppose we'd better be ready. Who wants to open the bowling out there? Where are the microphones? Okay, there's Jack's got one, and we have another one up here. So we'll start here, please. Okay, that's fine. And then there's one in the middle here, and then one up the back there. We'll take it from there.
Oh, right, this is a question for everybody. When we're talking about smart growth, let's think about the national and international context. What percentage of the population that has been brought into Melbourne and into Australia every year exports more than they import? And if we don't export, because I actually walked into places where literally you cannot find one hand up when you ask this question. How many people in this audience, when they think about their lives, when they think about their working lives, when they think about what they do for a living, how many people in this audience actually will die knowing that they exported more goods and services for the benefit of not only themselves but also Australia? How many will do that rather than say that they imported? Because I reckon we'd be lucky to find 1% of this audience that actually are net exporters. So how can we be smart when Victoria has a $40 billion trade deficit now? How can we be smart with our growth?
Robin, I guess we should start with that
one. I think you confuse two things. You're confusing growth and population increase with productivity and the notion of the knowledge economy. I can tell you how we can be smart. I happen also to be chair of the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and I go down into that marvellous precinct in Parkville, every other day. And we are surrounded by remarkable tertiary institutions, by remarkable research institutions that are in the top 10 in the world, by the remarkable Royal Melbourne Hospital, the Royal Women's, the Royal Children's. I see the 42,000 scientists that are at work in that precinct, and I think to myself, we do some of the best work in the world in biotech and in medical research, and we do it right there, close to the city, by design. Hang on, just let me answer. Just let me answer. And the other part about that is, I'm not sure what that has got to do. When I listened to Kelvin pretty carefully, by the way, mate, I'm sorry about the speeding ticket. I just want to make a point though. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I'm taking every dollar. I want to make the point. The reason we went to 40 kilometres an hour, and we should be clear on this. Below 40 kilometres an hour, there are no deaths. None. That is the traffic data. Okay? When you go from 40 to 50, deaths. Above 50, even more. Below 40, there are none. And that's why. Not just so that I could find you. Pleasurable though that may have been. And I look forward to your reductionist argument for the wheelchair, 20 kilometre an hour becoming true. The other argument that you make though, I think is different. It is what is going to make up that workforce of the future. I mean, I heard a lot from Kelvin then about, woe is me, this is terrible. I didn't hear him say anywhere we can actually stop it. Just a heartfelt plea at the end that maybe it'd be nice if we could. What I tried to focus on was the fact that we are growing, as Kelvin acknowledged. We are growing. He gave you all of those horrific facts about where we're going to be. Well, if that is the case, that's what we've got to deal with. Not some heartfelt hope, which I think would be counterproductive to say we can stop that in some way. That's what's counterproductive. So I didn't hear anything from Kelvin about how he might stop that growth that he was trumpeting to you for the applause. What I heard was a series of disaster scenarios, and trying to avoid that, I think, is where we should put our efforts.
That's not answering the question that was asked.
Kelvin, would you like to? Yeah, that was an answer actually, and I'm asking for courtesy. I'm asking for you to recognise you got first question and a fair suck of the sauce bottle, and I'm asking for any interjections, please. Kelvin, over to you.
The expression smart growth, by the way, has been popular US, and people who are interested might like to Google it and see how it operates there. But in terms of what we should be doing, I think that our economic base is too narrow, and that the way we have been going is leading to that narrowing of the base. And in terms of alternatives, being a practical person, I like to see what has worked elsewhere. And I look at Norway, which like us has been a resource-rich country, but which, unlike us, hasn't been running a population growth strategy and is only increasing very slowly. And armed with their sovereign wealth fund and their strategy of a much more stable arrangement, they have been able to keep their currency lower than others, to put money into support for manufacturing, support for research and development. So they end up with half our unemployment, free tertiary education and a budget surplus. So when we look at examples like that, it seems to me that there is an alternative path, and it is superior to the one that we are going down, and it is likely to give us more economic prosperity and self-sufficiency than one which leaves us being vulnerable and exposed to international shocks.
What's their personal tax rate there?
Yeah, well, that's fine.
80%. 80% is their personal tax rate.
They are running, that's fine, and people there are doing very well.
You know, they are, well, it's 80%.
If you would like to put your hand up,
That's because they take it from individuals. They have a personal tax rate of 80%.
can you please pay each other the courtesy and respect of putting your hand up and asking a question rather than interjecting? There's a next question, please. There's one just there, thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, yeah, both speakers of course make good points, both are actually right. One is thinking locally, the other is thinking globally. In 1975, Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb. World population was then 3.5 billion. He said to have more than 2 children was at best a mistake and at worst selfish and antisocial. The only people who listen to him were the Chinese, and I think they're examples one we should emulate. I just want to say that really, you're both right, but we do have a responsibility in Melbourne to take part of that population explosion. That's something we should be thinking about, and you're planning for it, that's good. On the other hand, our greatest concern is one of environmental degradation throughout the whole world. We're here on a dying planet, trying to get to a dead planet, which is crazy. And I really think population control is a must for everybody, including us. 2 children per family is enough.
Well, that's a comment. That's a comment, not a question, but it does lead to a very important question, which Robert says the answer to which, Robert, if I'm understanding you, is that there is an inevitability to this, and it does bring in a global element. And Kelvin, I'd be interested to hear from you how you might change the rate of population growth, what policies you would be advocating.
All right, there. Yes, this is a question that operates at a number of levels. At the global level, population has been increasing at the order of 80 million a year. I believe that is not sustainable, that gives us a poorer quality world and is devastating for the environment and does lie behind global problems, including global poverty and global terrorism. This is a matter for each country, in my view, to get its own house in order, and I think, frankly, that's easier than trying to solve the problem of carbon emissions, which has the different historical legacy. So each country has a role to play in seeking to stabilise its own population. In terms of Australia, the vast majority of our population growth is being driven by the spike in net overseas migration. I am not anti-migration. I don't say we should have no migration or no net migration. But what I do observe is that we used to have a net migration of the order of 70,000, 80,000 as recently as the 1980s and 1990s. We now have net overseas migration at over 200,000, so typically now 240,000. That is driving population increase, which will take Australia to over 40 million by 2050. And I think that is wrong, and that is the thing which should be pulled back. and in particular the migrant worker programs, which have been dramatically ratcheted up over the course of the past decade or decade and a half. And if we were to pull those things back, then we would see our population eventually stabilise, and not only that, we would have employment advantages and skills and training advantages for young Australians.
Robert, what's your view about the optimal number for that intake?
I don't have a view about an optimal number. I'm not sure the mathematics stack up there. If you're telling us we get to that size and it's 200,000 a year, that's 1 million every 5 years. So, I'm not sure that those maths stack up. I might have to do it more gymnastically. Look, I think the difficulty is, everything I'm hearing here, and I understand where you're coming from, and I sense that concern about our way of life and the way that our next generation will operate. What I haven't heard is a sensible strategy that says, here's how we stop that. I mean, if that's what you want, then I'm not your man, because I don't believe that. I believe in trying to manage it the best way we can in that way of smart growth. And it's easy to sort of just be negative about it. But even if I look at things that we do in the city now, look at the photos of the city. If you're talking about livability, we're about to publish the third in the Places for People series. 20 years of longitudinal study of the central city. Look down Thomson Street, there isn't a tree to be seen. Look down there now. Have a look at the urban forest canopy that's there now. Have a look at the improvements we've made and what we continue to do. So there's no magic about when we're at 2 million being a more sustainable or a more prosperous or a more beautiful city. But it does mean that you have to be smart about what you do. And a really simple thing is plant more trees in the central city to bring down the temperature by 4 to 5 degrees, because that's how much hotter we are than the outer suburbs, and do it in a period of time that you can manage, like 10 years. We're on track for that. We've been doing it for 4 years. But go back and look at what the city looked like then. And I would argue it is a far uglier and less environmentally friendly, less sustainable, less pleasant place to be, particularly in our very hot summers. And yet we have twice as many people. And we probably have 4 times as many people coming into the central city every day. And that's the sort of policy that I believe you've got to be looking at to keep us livable and to keep us the place that we want to be. It's not to do with population.
We have our next question up here with Jack, and then Jack down here in the blue shirt, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just following on from what you were saying there, Kelvin. I was just thinking that historically we have been inclusive and tolerant and respectful of the other cultures that have settled here. And I think, as you both pointed out, we have all been the beneficiaries of that throughout history. However, we have never experienced the rates of immigration as we are now. A lot of these people have already talked, either talking globally or from a macro point of view. I'm speaking from a micro point of view. I live in the city of Monash, and up until a few years ago, it was about 10 or 12 minutes drive for me to get from here to the city. Now it's far longer than that. I often feel very sorry for the people out in Lyndon or out in Casey. I just think it must be intolerable for them to have to commute each day. But even where I am now in the inner east, I'm in a position where in my neighbourhood, a lot of new residents, predominantly Asian residents, because they're interested in living in the areas because of the educational institutions that are nearby. They are pulling down good quality homes that have been there for the last 30, 40 years and putting, either 2-storey dogs boxes and townhouses on the property. Now, in my small street, the house right across the road from me that used to have 1 car, there's now 8 cars coming out of one property.
Could you draw this to a conclusion in a question, please?
The problems with parking, and my example is minimal compared to everyone else, but it is becoming, we are now becoming are happening in our neighbourhoods, in our cities.
Thank you. Kelvin, would you like to comment?
First, I agree with your observation that Melbourne has been a highly successful example of a community of people made up of many different backgrounds, and the area that I represent is an outstanding example of the success of post-war migration, particularly from southern and eastern Europe. So the population issue is not about race, it is about stewardship. It's too bad for anyone who wants it to be about race. The fact is that 1/4 of Australians were born somewhere else, and 1/2 have had either one or both parents born somewhere else, so it's too late if you're worried about that. It is a question of stewardship, and the way in which the numbers have skyrocketed over the course of the past decade or two. I agree with your comments about life for people on the urban fringe. The Lord Mayor correctly pointed out the problems of people living in Point Cook, and I do think that things like that certainly lead to great frustration. I know in Manhattan they've got these signs at every intersection saying a $300 fine if you honk your horn, but they honk their horns anyway because they are so frustrated about being stuck in traffic. So it's true that it leads to frustration, and looking at the kind of Melbourne that we've had in years gone by, it seems to me that there are better ways of doing this.
Robert?
Look, I don't think there's any great city in the world that's trying to bring more cars into the centre. You know, Manhattan is a particular example, but you know, that's not what great cities are trying to do. As I said, we get 840,000 people using the centre of the city on a quiet day and 1 million on a busy day. They don't all drive, and they can't. There are 600,000 people who move by our tram system alone in the inner city in any day. I'm not quite sure of this argument. I mean, I'm not quite sure of what I'm hearing from Kelvin here. But I think we'd agree it's very difficult to stop natural increase. People will do what people do, despite what we might want them to do. And we're not going to breach the Constitution and say people are not allowed to move from state to state or from city to city. So the only other way you can stop that population growth is to say we're going to stop migration. It's no good saying, oh, my electorate is made up of these. What you're saying is no more. Now, if that's what you're going to say, fine, say so bluntly. It is an argument about that, because I can't see how you can affect the other two.
Not no more, just not as many.
Well, that's an argument of degree, not of principle.
Jack, there's been a very patient gentleman down here.
At least you're honest. Just give you that.
All right. So my question is to the Lord Mayor. I'd like to thank both of you for being open. I can understand that you both have socially responsible attitudes to what you're talking about. But Australia has had a compound rate of population growth since 1900 of over 1.6% per annum. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, yet we are using, this has driven the global economy for over 100 years. I don't think this is a question about detail, it's a big picture question. And you have to accept that, I know the Lord Mayor's talked about the inevitability of it, but the reality is that it's an autocratically imposed policy by the federal government. The federal government, when it sees GDP growth slowing down and wants a solution to keep up that GDP growth, it uses a surge of migration to deal with it. That was done by Kevin Rudd during the GFC. Now, you can question the wisdom and why that should have been done, whether it was socially responsible or not. The reality is you can't double population every 40 years permanently. It just doesn't work. And we've come through all of that in the 20th century. Now we have to be realistic about looking at what we can do to stabilise it. And I think that's the question for me, is why do you think it's inevitable?
Well, because of the reason I said before. At the risk of repeating myself, I don't think you're going to stop natural increase. People will do what people do. Hang on. I don't think you're going to stop that unless you. If you think we can, if you want to go to a one-child policy, I don't think I can support that.
Straw man.
Can we please stop interjecting and allow him to answer the question?
And I come back to what I said, and I don't think you'll stop the. If you're talking about Melbourne, the thing that's driving Melbourne is not, you might think it is that external migration, and it's a part of it, but a lot of it is people coming to us from regional and country Victoria and from other states. That migration that comes from Australia itself has been part of it. And as Kelvin said, for all of Australia, it's 200,000 people, every year into Australia from overseas. So, unless you're going to be bold and say, and that's a different argument. If you want to have that, that's fine. I couldn't agree with you. But if you're going to say, slash those numbers in half and then slash them in half again, that's fine. You can make that argument. But I kind of hear you tippy-toeing around that. If that's what you mean, say so.
Kelvin,
So you're saying that's what we should do? All right. Okay. I would disagree with you. But at least you're blunt enough to say so.
Kelvin was making, excuse me, please. Kelvin was making the point and said the numbers should go from 240 to about 90, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, let's be clear about this. Where population growth comes from, the Victorian report of 2014 says that Victoria is tracking from 5.5 million to 10 million between now and 2050. That of that, 1.8 million will be natural increase, that is to say 3.8 million births and 2 million deaths. It's important to understand that because there are some people who say that we're below replacement rate and if we're not careful our population is going to fall and so on. This is not true. Births are exceeding deaths every year. So 1.8 million from natural increase, 2.7 million from net overseas migration and Victoria's share of that. So that is the biggest driver of it. And the amount from net interstate migration is 15,000. So never mind that, we don't have to put up anything at the borders or whatever to stop people. That is not an issue. The net overseas migration is much larger than it used to be, and my position, to be clear, is that it should be taken back to where it used to be. And the demographic advice that I've received from Bob Birrell and others is that around 70,000 a year, so net 70,000 a year, would over time stabilise the population. Now, if the demographic advice on that changes, then you have to revisit it. But that's the advice that I have received. So it's not about no migration or no net migration. It's saying go back where we were, because that would enable us to sort the thing out. We wouldn't crash land the plane, we would land the plane.
Thank you for everyone. This is a very interesting discussion. My name's David Hughes. I was jailed for 7 years for selling oral contraceptives over the internet by the ACCC. That was one of the things you could do, Lord Mayor, is to have oral contraceptives in supermarkets without a prescription. That would lower the birth rate. But my question tonight is about infrastructure. We've got an infrastructure Prime Minister, and we know that infrastructure takes 20, 30, 40, 50 years to build and pay it off. Why do we give new migrants all the infrastructure for free? Do migrants, once upon a time they had to go and work on the Snowy Mountain scheme or the Koowa River Hydro scheme before they came to the cities? They don't have to live in tents on the boundaries of Tullamarine Airport. I helped build Tullamarine Airport when I was a kid. It's said, perhaps Kelvin can enlighten me, that the infrastructure for every additional person is about $100,000. If migrants had to pay an infrastructure tariff or a fee or an entry ticket, then we could pay for the desalination plants and the east-west tunnels and the second river crossing. Why do we have to pay for future migrants' infrastructure?
Kelvin, would you like to take that first?
I don't advocate changing the fee arrangements and so on associated with migration, but there is a point that I referred to in terms of Joan O'Sullivan's research, which shows that a society which is growing at 1% per annum or 2% per annum ends up with this massively increased infrastructure burden. So because the typical life of infrastructure is around 50 years. And so in every country and community which is experiencing population growth at this level, there is always an infrastructure problem. So it's not that this given federal government or state government or local council is lazy or corrupt or whatever. It's just inherent in the system that you can't keep up, whereas in a stable population community you can keep up, and many of those communities are able to be more successful in terms of the provision of public transport services and the like. And that is why people find their electricity bills are increasing by double the rate of inflation, gas bills, council rates and all the rest of it. And that's why I say, and for many other reasons, why we ought to be pulling back our rate of population growth so that it makes infrastructure affordable.
There's a young man here with his hand up. Just to your, just here. Thank you. Just right there. Thank you. And then there's a lady down the front here, Jake, afterwards. Thank you. Okay, please.
Yeah, guys. My question is, I'd like to just know how local, state and federal government would act on bribes or donations to politicians by property developers.
I think this is a problem area. You're probably aware that the New South Wales government, after instances of scandal and corruption there, moved to outlaw campaign donations from property developers. But what in fact happened is that certain politicians and political organisations didn't take that ban seriously now, and they're now having an interesting time of it, explaining themselves before the New South Wales ICAC as to the various things that they did to get around that ban. I think it is the question of campaign donations from property developers is problematic, and I would be happy to see further steps of the kind that have been taken in New South Wales.
Okay. So I'm still going through the mental gymnastics trying to work out why 70,000 people fewer in Australia every year obviates the tens of millions problem that Kelvin was evincing earlier, but I'm not quite fast enough anymore. Let me give you an example, and I think this is a deliberately pointed and loaded question. Really, I do. Directly. That's okay. Because what I have to do is actually declare that and be audited, and then I can't vote. I can tell you Kelvin's party at a federal level, and my party at a federal level, and Kelvin's party at a state level, and my party at a state level, all take donations from property developers, and they vote quite happily on things that might affect those people's businesses without declaring any such conflict, although that contribution has helped to get them elected. But then I would also say to you, why stop there? Why not business? Or why not individuals? Or why not community groups? You know? And so my view about that is, make it plain and transparent, and then prevent people from voting when those people are before you for decision. And that's what I have to do. So in many cases, if you want to, I understand the loadedness of your question, but the reality is, I've yet to see a state or federal politician rule themselves out of voting on something because one of these groups has made a contribution either directly to them in their own local campaign, which they can do, you know, which they don't have to abstain from when these matters are before them. And remember, we're creatures of state government after all, which, you know, Kelvin and I are both members of the state parliament. So my view would be, would you rather have this clandestine thing where you pretend it's all at arm's length, or out in the open where I have to declare it, and any time that comes before us, I have to abstain, and if I don't, there are quite serious and indeed quite draconian penalties for me doing so. They work in both systems, and I'll take that one.
Thank you. There's a lady down the front here.
My name's Jenny Ward. I believe recently that the Productivity Commission announced that with increasing growth, population growth, our individual prosperity is actually falling. So I'd like the Lord Mayor to elaborate on why he thinks increased growth means greater prosperity for individuals. And while you're doing that, could you elaborate on how we can have infinite growth on a finite planet?
planet as something of a tagline rather than a serious question. You think I'm for infinite growth? I mean, come on, be serious. I mean, I'm just not going to debate that one, I'm sorry. Look, I haven't seen those productivity commission figures. I would argue, look at Melbourne now. Are we a more prosperous and a more well-off than we were in the 1970s?
Does it mean we'll continue to be though?
Okay. I can't convince you that, that's fine.
There's a lady over here with her hand up. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I'd like to know what's different about Scandinavia and Europe from Australia that a sort of relatively stable population wasn't inevitable in Europe, isn't inevitable in Europe. Why are we different?
We're a place that people want to come. This is, well, you know, I mean, Scandinavia is a different, I mean, everyone points to Scandinavia, but as I've said, there's a separate social milieu operating there, where there were socialist states for a long time, with very high levels of personal taxation and all benefits provided. And that's a particular model that some of them have now moved away from. I don't see them as natural comparators. You know, I look at some of the American cities and the Canadian cities and the way they're growing and think that's much more like us. We're not like Asian cities either, but we are us. You know, that's what we are. If you think that Kelvin 70,000 people per suit for all of Australia every year will solve the problem, I don't think it will, to be honest, the things you're pointing out to me, given that I'm for infinite growth on a finite planet.
There's a gentleman up the back who looks very enthusiastic, and Jack is about to give him the microphone. Yeah, that's over to you.
You're holding it out to me. In your considerations for having more people, have you realized and counted in that we use more non-renewable resources, more energy, that we are more polluting the soil, the water, the atmosphere, and exacerbate climate change? And if all the cities in the world are like have the policies like you have, they're going down the drain very quickly. Have you considered this? And if you had, I think you'd be saying no more growth of population, because the numbers we have now on the planet, we are the greatest threat to our planet.
I think we have a threshold issue here. I said at the start that I would concede that population growth is the greatest challenge we face. And I think that is the case. I just don't think that it can be obviated. I think it will happen. Now, if that is, and lots of people disagree with me, and that's fine. But I don't think it will happen. Okay, that's my belief. So what I work towards is trying to keep the city as sustainable and as livable as I can. And I talked before about planting 3,000 trees a year for 10 years in order to help do that, to do smarter things about the way we grow. Now, you may shake your head, but I haven't yet heard, and I don't accept, that 70,000 people fewer every year into Australia is going to halt the problems that you are so obviously concerned about. So all I can do is say, all right, maybe I'm wrong. And maybe you will be able to halt that. Maybe I'm wrong. But maybe I'm wrong, okay? But at least what I'm trying to do is do things to cope with that growth. I don't see that you can simply say, we must stop that growth, where every year that growth has continued. And you may, well, but it hasn't happened. Federal governments, state governments, local governments, population movements haven't allowed it to happen. So you can say, but this must happen. Meantime, life goes on. So all I can do is try to do the things that cope with those extra people as best I can.
Kelvin, what's your view on the environmental sustainability elements of this debate?
I think that the present way that we're operating is quite unsustainable, that we are treating the earth as a business in liquidation, and that if you look at things like the water resources or the capacity to feed the world's growing population or the fate of many species of birds and plants and animals which are headed on what I think is a long and sad march to extinction, I think that the present arrangements, that their impact on the environment is little short of catastrophic, and that much of that is driven by numbers. There are other factors at work, of course, lifestyle and technology and things like that count, but that the relentless growth in numbers is having very adverse environmental impacts.
The gentleman here, thank you.
My name is Ian Penrose, and I particularly want to thank the outdoor worker being here amongst a fairly hostile audience. I admire your work in marketing Melbourne. I admire your work in trying to make Melbourne livable. I want to answer one of your questions as well as ask my question of you. One question you've asked is population growth is inevitable. You've also said it's our greatest challenge. However, you've also said it is important for prosperity. And the last point I must disagree, because to me population growth is making it hard to be prosperous. The resources we are spending on just coping with the population growth will be much better spent all on improving the lives of current Australians. So to me, the answer to your question is how can we stop it? I think the first step is admitting it's a problem rather than barracking for it. My question to you, it's like saying you go to your doctor and he says you've got a disease. I don't know the solution, but let's talk about the disease you've got. What I'm hearing from many people is, we don't know the solution, but I'll keep barracking for it. My question to you, Lord Mayor, is this. If you had the choice of using all the resources and energy you put into Melbourne, using it all for increasing the lives of Melburnians, new and existing ones, and not diverting it just to cope with the extra numbers, would you do that?
Thank you, Ian. Ian Penrose makes a remarkable contribution to the Yarra River and has given really a lifetime to making sure that our river, along with the Yarra River campus, is the jewel that it is today, and was doing so in the days when people would turn their backs on the river. So thank you for that. The answer is yes, I would. You know, as I said, I've recently looked at the third in the issues of places for people, where we actually changed the way we operated in the city of Melbourne from when we had, you know, in the 1980s, when the study they were thinking about it, they started collecting data in the early 1990s. And you can look at things like how many cafes are there in the city, and then you see them exploding decade by decade, and seats, you know, out in the public realm. How long do people stay in the city? How long are they still? So they're not rushing from place to place. They're stopped and they're enjoying their city. And it may be on a park bench or in a chair, you know, out on a footpath, or just looking at a shop window. And that has grown remarkably over the decades. And I look at that larger number of people who now live in the inner city compared to when Norman Day called us a dead heart. And I think that we are a more prosperous, more diverse, more interesting, more creative city. Busier? Yes, we are. More crowded, more congested? Yes, we are. But I think inevitably, nevertheless, a better city. So yes, I would put my energies into those people who've come into the inner city.
Mary? You have a question over there with Mary?
Mary wants the last word, so if we can make hers the last question.
We've got a bit of time first. There's a gentleman over here who's looking very keen.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Ian Wood, Savo Suburbs. I was interested, Kelvin, to hear you say that about that article in Science magazine, was it, that referred to the likelihood that population growth would continue to 11 billion by 2100. I'm wondering if both the speakers were aware of the Guardian article about research from the Melbourne Sustainability Institute that looked at the old limits for growth predictions from 1972, which predicted global economic and population collapse by about the middle of this century. And the work that's been done on feeding new current data into those models shows that we are still on track for that. Are you aware of that information? And if so, shouldn't we be treating that as serious, at least as climate change?
Well, I'm not aware of the specific research. I am aware of concerns that people have expressed about our capacity on a range of fronts. So the energy front, peak oil, and the food front, and of course climate change and other things which have the capacity to dramatically change the world. These things are real problems. What impact they will have in future remains to be seen, but it certainly seems to me that we are not living in a sustainable way, whether it's at an individual level or at a community level or at a nationwide level or at a global level. And so the failure to address these things and just assume that this growth can go on forever, I think, is foolish and mistaken. And the point about us that no, we can't grow infinitely on a finite planet is absolutely right. And it seems to me that the way this has occurred in the course of the last century is quite without precedent, totally different from the sort of global impact that we've had in times gone by. So I do think that we have to address those things.
Robert, you might, the report you're referring to is, of course, the Club of Rome Limits to Growth report, which has as many detractors as it has supporters, but it's a very, very interesting report. And I know, Dominic, you might want to address this in your answer, that in the last 20 years, the number of people on the planet living in extreme poverty has been halved.
Yeah. And I am aware of it. I have not read it in great depth. And it does have some other elements to it as well. Look, I mean, I don't like this argument being driven to extremes. I mean, infinite growth, going on forever. I mean, I just don't think that's worthy of a very serious topic, because no one believes that. I certainly don't. Infinite growth going on forever. I mean, really, come on. Now, to take your point, one of the things we worry about quite properly is food security. And one of the issues raised by this report is around that. I happen to be an ambassador because a group of my friends started a charity called Second Bite, where we recycle fresh food to those people who need it, and we distribute millions and millions of meals every year. At the moment in Victoria, we waste 1 billion kilos of fresh food every year. Every year. So I think there's a fair bit of getting our own house in order before we ascribe to doomsday theories. And that's a simple one about fresh food going to waste in this state every single year.
You've just jogged my memory. I'm an ambassador for Second Bite too, and I must say it's an extraordinary organisation that is doing some fantastic stuff with food. We do have enough food. That's not the problem. There's a question here.
Question for Kelvin Thomson. Kelvin, what can we all do that could make a difference and be heard by both sides of government? For example, it's been suggested we could reduce immigration on ballot papers. That's been suggested. Should this be promoted? It's simple and it's easy and it could work. What do you think?
Well, people can write things on ballot papers and seek to influence those who read ballot papers. In terms of what I'm seeking to do in relation to this, about a year ago I set up a community organisation, non-government organisation called Victoria First. I've encouraged people to join that. I want to use that as a vehicle for seeking to lift population up the totem pole as an area for debate. I think it's regrettable that it languishes and doesn't get the attention that its significance warrants. But obviously the more that people can do in terms of contacting people who are involved in the political process. We've got a state election coming up in a few weeks' time, whether it's federal elections or local government elections, and contacting people who are involved in media, using social media, using other groups with an interest in the environment or in the concerns of young people and the like. I think that there is plenty of scope for people to be active and try and get messages across.
Next question.
Don't write on your ballot paper. I mean,
the scrutineers see that.
No dance work with you.
You've got to...
Excuse me, I'm really thinking that you probably should be a little bit more courteous and allow others a fair go too.
I think what you should do is what Kelvin suggested. I mean, one of the beauties of our city and our nation is that open public debate is fostered. You know, if this is what you believe, and lots of you disagree with me, and that's fine. I hope you think it's fine for me to disagree with you as well. But you need to convince principally the federal
reduce immigration. Everybody can.
There's a question just in front of you. Thank you.
This is a question for Lord Mayor. You're focused on inner city, like how many cafes? I've seen 3 today. So, I like cafes. And I like trees as well. But I don't think the number of trees in the inner city, the number of cafes in the inner city, is really what is occupying the minds of most Melburnians. I think you're the Lord Mayor, I understand that. So the central city is your area. But I think you need to think about the whole city of Melbourne. In my suburb, it's the one that Kelvin represents. Yes, we are having high population growth. It is very hard to get a ride on the tram. It does take a long time to get up Lycon Street. All of these things, I think you need to just broaden your focus a bit. I understand that your role is a much more focused role than that.
Can I make 2 points to that? The first is, when I talk about the number of cafes and trees, it is about the lifestyle of the city which adds up to livability, which is so important for us all. That's what we're trying to protect, surely. And that's what this whole debate is about. But what is the level of population growth that will see us retain or lose livability? And that's what they're measures of. Secondly, mine is the fastest municipality in growth in Australia. You don't have to tell me about growth. Ours is the fastest growing municipality. I deal with it every single day. And if I don't deal with it, and if I don't say yes to some of those developments that are where I believe they should be along those transport corridors, then we continue to expand at the edges. And I agree with Kelvin. He quoted me about the suburb of Clyde. I was quite outspoken about not destroying the market gardens of Melbourne for housing. So the other part is I can only be what I can be. You know, I don't have responsibility. I have views from time to time on outer metropolitan Melbourne, but I don't have any power. You know, and so when I talk about those things, it's not flippantly or as individual examples. It's examples of what it is that does make us livable. You know, I wish politicians would stop messing around with our number plates and leave it as the Garden State, because that's what we were. Our gardens and our trees are particularly important to us, and they're particularly important for all of the things that you were talking about around sustainability and environmental health. So I don't take them as small issues at all, and I do well understand the imperatives of a growth municipality, given that I'm in the fastest growing municipality in Australia.
We're very close to out of time. Kelvin,
can we address the matter's effect on our culture, please?
We're very nearly out of time. Kelvin, can you please spend 3 minutes wrapping up your position, then Robert to you, then Mary's coming over to speak, and then I'll wrap it up. Kelvin, thank you.
Okay, a really interesting and worthwhile discussion on the tree planting. Fine in theory, but have a look at what they're proposing to do at Royal Park, and the planning minister has quietly got rid of the requirement for like open space compensation. I've said before that Australia already is a multiracial society, with 1/4 of us born overseas and 1/2 having one or both parents born overseas. So the population debate is not about race, it is about stewardship. We've had a bit of a discussion about jobs. Often people talking about jobs leave out half the story. They need to talk more about how many people are unemployed or underemployed. And discussion about jobs must be about employment levels and unemployment levels, and about participation rates. Now, advocates of population growth, and the Lord Mayor said as much this evening, using words like more prosperous, more tolerant, more diverse, more interesting city, that today's world is superior and a better one to live in than the dull and boring past. Well, I grew up in the 1960s. We had the Beatles, Carnaby Street, hippies, Christine Keeler, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Rudolph Nureyev, Andy Warhol. In Melbourne we had the Masters Apprentices, Daddy Cool, Skyhook, Sherbet, Zoot and Chain. It was not dull. We had full employment. What we didn't have was youth unemployment. We didn't have graduate unemployment and underemployment. We didn't have massive student debt. We didn't have people unable to afford to buy a house or even rent one. For the city of Moonee Valley, the Department of Human Services' latest data shows a 90% decline in rental affordability. We didn't have the rising teenage depression and anxiety reported recently in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. We didn't have the problem of begging in the CBD, and the Lord Mayor reported in the middle of this year that begging is an issue that affects everyone in Melbourne. When the Lord Mayor said that things are better now in the 1970s, I went to a school reunion last year where I had classmates say I dropped out of university and the day afterwards I got a job as a medical scientist and that's still what I'm doing. Or the woman who said I dropped out in year 12 and my mum got me a job as a nurse at the local hospital and I've made a career out of that. My kids and their generation do not have the same opportunities that I and my generation had. The world I grew up in the 1960s has been broken by rapid population growth, but you know the saying, you break it, you own it. And the cheerleaders for rapid population growth, well, they own the modern world and they have to take responsibility for it, all of it. With its global warming, global diseases, global terrorism, global poverty and the neighbourhood consequences, drugs, crime, mental health, traffic, loss of public open space and the long sad march of many birds, plants and animals towards extinction. And the things that we used to be able to afford, free education, free healthcare, home of your own, a say in what happens in our street, now we're told we can't afford them anymore. Well, if we can't, we're not better off, we're worse off. What I want us to do is to show the same foresight the founders of this city showed. We should leave a legacy for future generations that we and they can be proud of.
Kelvin, most of which I went to see. I'd also remind you of our attitude towards women, towards older people, towards same-sex couples, towards different cultures, different religions. You know, I think we've got to be very careful about letting this genie out of the bottle. I also think this is illusory. It may be populist. You cannot go back to the 1970s. You know, no one, no matter what they promise or what you might wish or what you hope for, no one can deliver you the world of the 1970s again. It just isn't going to happen. It's illusory, and I think it's dangerous. We might not agree on population targets or population cap, but we've all agreed today about the fact that we have got population growth. My answer to you is, I try to do things about that. Not promise you we can go back to the 1970s, which was some halcyon days. Whether or not that's true is immaterial. It can't be done. You cannot. You cannot. Well, he just did. He just did say that. That's exactly what he said. And the point is, you can't do that. And so all I'm saying to you is, agree or disagree about population targets and where we're going. One of the root agreements of tonight has been that our population is growing. Now, one question you may have for the longer term is, we wish to do something about that stops that. I don't believe you can. So even if we both disagree on that, we would surely agree what we need to do tomorrow and next week and next month is something about that population growth and how we make it happen in our city. If you are successful in your quest and you can return to the days of the Masters Apprentices, well and good. Well and good. But if you can't, meantime, what are you going to be doing? Because that's what I'm focused on, what we can do in our city. You might not agree with my view about population growth and what it brings. But I hope that we can all agree in the end in the short term, in the days and weeks and months and even years ahead, we need to be focused on what we're doing about what is actually happening right now. And that's what I'm prepared to work with you.
Mary, I believe you want to say something before I wrap up?
Yes, mine's not a wrap-up. Mine is actually a question. But before I ask my question, I want to thank the Lord Mayor very much for coming tonight. It was right here on this spot that I challenged him to this debate. Thank you. And thank you, Kelvin, for being a good sport and coming, and thank you, Michael, for doing the course. Now my question to both speakers. We, the people, have never been asked what we think about such a big increase in population. It's time we had a referendum to let the people have a say. That's democracy. What does each speaker think about asking the feds for a referendum?
I'm in favour of it. We had a detailed consideration of this in the middle of the year at a meeting in Hawthorne, and that was the sense of that meeting, and I agree with it and I support it.
Robert?
It's a little beyond my power to grant. I mean, Kelvin's mob were in power from 07 until recently, and nothing happened there. I don't see it being on the agenda here. I think it is a good thing to do to advocate for such referendum. I've got no problem with that. I don't have a personal view about whether it's a good or a bad thing, but I think if you can get that question onto the federal political agenda, then that is very much worthwhile pursuing. I've got absolutely no problem with that at all. One of the things that we're doing in the City of Melbourne at the moment is we have a people's jury, a citizen jury of a number of selected people who are a cross-section of the City of Melbourne, selected quite scientifically, and we're asking them to look at our 10-year financial plan so that they are helping us to make those decisions. And involved in that is asking them to consider that notion of population growth and what it means for the city. So at a very local level, we're going directly to the people who represent our city to ask them what they think and what they think should inform our decision making, and giving them the information, including about population growth, to help them to advise us. So all I can say at a local level, we're actually doing it in that participatory, democratic way, in a way that I'm quite proud of, and that my council, I think, have been, extremely innovative in suggesting. If you want to try to get it on the federal agenda, well, here's your man. Good luck.
Robert, I said we'd finish by 7 for you. I know you have to go, so I just wanted to close quickly by thanking our speakers again, Robert Doyle and Kelvin Thomson, for a spirited and compelling contest. It was a contest in the most important marketplace we have, which is the free market for ideas. I'd like to thank again Mary Drost of Planning Backlash and Jack Roach of the Burundara Residents Action Group. Most of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming and for caring. Whatever your view about the big population debate, and I think it was fairly clear what most of the views were here tonight, but whatever your view, everybody here shares a desire to keep our community free and fair and prosperous, and I find that a very uplifting thing. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.